People of Earth, we have come to upgrade your cosmic consciousness. DNA activation ready. In 3, 2, 1.
Hi, welcome to Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. I'm Lou Quinto.
And I'm Craig Anderson.
Craig, we're going to talk about a topic today that is really become a focal point for a lot of businesses and organizations, and that is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And, you know, we can joke about the old diversity training in the mid-90s and everything, but it really, I think this time it's going to take hold. And so what we've done is we've invited Kevin King, who is the CEO and founder of Transformation Point in Colorado. And Kevin has over 35 years of experience in facilitating teams and defining solutions to business challenges and developing and coaching leaders for improving organizational performance. Kevin is an expert in the area of EDI. What we wanted to do is we wanted to bring him in to give us his perspective and what he's learned when it comes to working with companies that want to begin moving toward a better equity, diversity, and inclusion environment. He's also the author of a book called Think, Change Your Story and Change Your Life. And when we get done talking to him, we'll ask him about that book. But we're going to focus on EDI right now. So let's bring on Kevin King. Well, welcome, Kevin. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing wonderful. Thank you, Lou.
Thanks for joining us on Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership for a very, I'll say, sensitive but very important topic that I believe every company is wrestling today, and that is equality, diversity, and inclusion. And so before we get into it, I'll give you an opportunity here to just prop yourself up, give us a little bit of a background on your expertise in this area that we're going to spend a few minutes talking about.
Okay. I'd say my expertise comes from multiple different forms, my lived experience, my academic experience, and then just having done work in multiple different countries with people that represent over 40 different nationalities. And I avoided actually getting in this space back in the day when it was just called diversity.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because I didn't want to get pigeonholed from a career perspective. And I think for me at that particular point in time, I just didn't think it was the right time for me to make any significant contribution to the domain out in the world. And so today, I feel like I'm in that position where I can integrate all of those different factors that make me uniquely me,
Right.
and have a strong voice in this space.
Sure. And it's obviously the space has grown as a category because
Yes.
it's not just diversity anymore, it's equality and inclusion as well, which is a far departure from what it was when it was first introduced into corporate America. And so the reason why Craig and I wanted to have this discussion is that, you know, all census statistics show that by the year 2050, the United States will become a minority majority country. And that's going to affect our lives in so many different aspects, but also it's going to affect how businesses operate.
Yes.
And, you know, Craig calls me the old man of the podcast. And so let me take a trip down memory lane. You start to touch on it, Kevin, a little bit there. But, you know, it's back in the mid to late 90s. That's when companies started to introduce this diversity training. And they spent a ton of money putting all of their employees through diversity training. And these training courses would be, everyone would sit in like a group therapy circle with a paid facilitator, and they would share their perspectives on different things. They would talk about language and behavior that was offensive to them, and also talk about things that offended them as well. And I believe, in my opinion, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I believe that training, it literally was a popularity wave. And I think that wave crashed ashore about the early 2000s, where at that point, companies really only provide diversity training now to new hires. And so it's not, we're going to put everybody through. And for a long time now, since the early 2000s, I think a lot of business leaders have made the mistake of thinking that diversity training to new hires is the cure or the solution to the problem, when in actuality, it's probably just window dressing now. But I mean, over the past couple of years, we've got the Me Too movement. You have the increased awareness to racial and ethnic injustice, probably symbolized by Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee during the anthem. And then, of course, the tragic death of George Floyd this past summer. It's really raised the awareness of lots of companies because their next generation of leaders that are populating the workforce are demanding equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I believe what we're seeing now is a response to what employees want, as opposed to in the 90s, it was what management felt they had to do to make them more diverse. So let's start simply for our viewers and our listeners, okay? And let's take this important and sometimes highly politically charged topic step by step and unpack it. And when we deal with equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now, those terms are interconnected, but they're different. Can you take a few minutes and talk to us about the differences between those three words?
Okay. So equity is really around recognizing that people start at different points. Generally in this country, we talk about it in terms of the history of systemic racism in this country and systemic disadvantage, and the disparity between marginalized groups and the predominant group, in forms of discrimination, and many other things. When we talk about diversity, it really is around representation. It's making sure that we have representation from a broad set of people, cultures, genders, sexual orientations, abilities, things of that nature. And this country's done a relatively good job of incrementally over time being able to broaden what we mean by what we mean by diversity. Inclusion, though, is really where the rubber meets the road. It's like, okay, so we can have a lot of representation, but do we actually engage that representation in a way that fosters an environment and a culture where people can contribute to their potential in that organization? Regardless of where the starting line is for them, they have an opportunity to advance and contribute to the maximum of their potential. And so when you talk about equity in itself, it's really around recognizing that not everyone has the same starting line. When we talk about diversity, it's about representation and opening up and make sure that we have a broad set of representation, not only in the form of the EEOC categories and the protected categories, but cognitive difference, personality, style differences, things of that nature that are not necessarily legislated, but also come into play. And I consider them to be very foundational. When we talk about inclusion, it's about fostering an environment where people basically feel a couple of different things. Number one, that they feel like they are connected and that they belong. Number two, that they're valued for the uniqueness that they bring to the organization. And number three, that they're shown genuine gratitude and appreciation for their contributions to the team. And so when equity comes into play, it's about, do I have an equitable chance of contributing to the team, given where my starting point is coming into an organization?
Right. I love that. Before I turn it over to Craig, I love that analogy of that starting line, because I think I saw something online during COVID probably, where they put a whole bunch of people on a starting line, and then they read out different categories or different characteristics. And if you had that characteristic or was of that characteristic, you had to take 3 steps back. And they went through this long list of, you know, if you're African American, if you're Asian, if your parents were immigrants, if you have a high school, if you don't have a college education, and people kept stepping back and back and back. And then you looked at those people on the line that didn't move. Yes. And so I like that analogy, because that was a great video. If our listeners and viewers can find it online, it was a great visual representation of understanding that systematic or the systemic racism that you're talking about, and how people are set back from the very beginning before the race even starts.
Yes.
So, Craig?
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things we were talking about when we were thinking about the topics for this, Kevin, is as businesses are looking at this, right? Is this more of a internally focused effort, looking at how we're stacked up internally along the equity, diversity, and inclusion? Or should they also be looking externally around, suppliers, customers, vendors that they work with? How do they kind of look at this holistically as they're
Okay.
moving forward?
It's interesting you should ask that, because I believe most organizations today are really taking a more holistic approach. They're looking at it from an employee perspective in terms of recruitment, and emphasis on retention, which is that inclusion component of it. They're looking at their vendors. They're looking at how they align, and I've experienced this quite a bit when I was working in consulting, not for myself, but at other organizations, that customers are really asking to make sure that you had a diverse team to do the work that they were contracting out. And so they began to show that they valued that their vendors were also engaged and embraced in diversity as well. And so I believe that in today's focus, I think organizations are taking a much more holistic perspective. I believe they're starting, for those that are less mature on the curve, dealing with equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think they're starting with hiring and trying to get more representation. But then that also begs, or I should say, highlights the responsibility around retention, right? So in recruiting, we're basically creating a brand promise. We're saying, here's who we are. We embrace diversity. We're an inclusive organization. We work in an environment where we're fostering more equitable advancement of employees. But then the systems and the structures and processes internally to retain those employees and to truly develop them often are lacking. So they're trying to do more of a two-pronged approach to being able to address that. And then again, also too, a lot of these decisions are being driven by the demands of their customers, meaning that their customers are demanding that they have more equity, diversity, and inclusion as a focus within their organizations. And then they're more capable from a bottom line profitability perspective. They're more capable of being able to meet the demands of a diverse customer base if in fact they have that diversity, equity, and inclusion focus internally within their organizations and among their vendors.
Okay. So yeah, so it is really a bigger picture that we're looking at all
Yes.
across the streams, driven again, as I think Lou talked about earlier. It's really almost a customer demand, if nothing else, that's driving a lot of these decisions today.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, and one of the things that I like to do, Kevin, here is before we dive in to, and I'm just going to use EDI instead
Okay.
of saying equity, diversity, and inclusion all the time.
Okay.
So for our listeners and viewers from here on out, if you just hear EDI, that's what we're talking about. But before we talk about the situation, the issue, the problem, whatever you might want to call it, I want you to share the benefits that a company will enjoy, that business leaders will appreciate when they have a good EDI program within their organization.
Okay. I think often we have this conversation as if it's its own unique lane, and it has so many connectors and tentacles connected to other aspects of doing business. So I'm going to start my response with just the focus of employee engagement. And so when we look at Gallup and we look at the research that Gallup's done, we know that a manager's relationship with their supervisor an employee's relationship with their manager has a very profound impact on their level of engagement. We also know that organizations that have higher levels of engagement are more profitable, more efficient, they have higher degrees of effectiveness, and so forth. Well, that's great if we only look at engagement from the perspective of engagement. But if we start to break down engagement and look at it and look at it in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, then what we're looking at are points of connection. Employees want to be connected to the mission, vision, values of the organization. They want to be connected to the work itself, and they want to be connected to each other. The EDI component is about being connected to each other. So if we had a 5-point checklist relative to how an organization fosters this type of environment, what we're looking at are those same things I said earlier, but I expand on it a bit more, which is this. Number one, everyone wants to feel connected and engaged. Okay, and so that means they want to feel like they belong.
Right.
They want to feel like they're valued. They want to feel gratitude and appreciation for their contributions. They want to know that their managers and supervisors are actually doing the work to get better at doing those things. And then they want to work in a culture that they truly believe values equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that they foster an environment that is more open and where they feel more connected. And so when you think about this journey that organizations are on relative to this topic, the value proposition for them is that they get a more engaged workforce, which means lower turnover on that retention side. They get better decision making. Some of the research says that companies with the lowest 25% of gender, racial, and diversity the lowest 25% sector of gender and racial diversity are 29% more likely to underperform than their competitors in the
Right.
same space.
Sure.
We know that the companies that do embrace it are 43% more likely to experience higher profits. We also recognize that, again, there's lower turnover rate. When we look at diverse teams, which is basically the same or similar to what we talk about when we talk about heterogeneous teams versus homogeneous teams, they make better business decisions 87% of the time. They're 2 times faster in making those decisions, and they have half the number of meetings in order to be able to get to those results. Employees who perceive themselves on the opposite end of this as being the target of bias are 3 times more likely to be disengaged, which we know erodes profitability, 3 times more likely to withhold their ideas, and 3 times more likely to leave their job within a year.
That's interesting, because I from one perspective, I can see it is that everybody, when it comes to decision making, you've got a very diverse group of people and they look at it from different perspectives, as opposed to having those blinders on of, this is the way we've always done it. And people bring that perspective into play. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's it. And I think tying it to engagement is also something I think that was new to me as we started looking into learning more about this to prepare for the interview, is really tying it into engagement, because that's something that I've really focused on when I was running my business, is trying to drive those engagement numbers up. And we had a call center business largely, so it was trying to get all those folks to feel inclusive and included was a big key to the success, but it was never without its challenges. So as we're thinking about this from a business owner perspective, and I want to try and create this more diverse and inclusive work culture, what are the things I should be looking for? What are the characteristics that I should be thinking about as I start wanting to build that within my organization?
Time and time again, what I've discovered in consulting engagements is this: you want to be looking for your managers to be inclusive leaders. So GE Healthcare was one of my large clients years ago, and I did a lot of worldwide training for them. They bought our inclusive leadership program. And one of the GE growth leadership values back at that time was inclusive leader. And so when you think about the impact on the organization in terms of bang for the buck, the managers, and notice I'm going back to Gallup, which is the managers have the more profound impact on employees' level of engagement. So if managers are better equipped to be able to foster an inclusive environment, to manage themselves, identify their own unconscious bias, their own implicit biases, to be able to be willing to work on those, to be able to move and be comfortable moving outside of their comfort zone to create a space where people feel more connected and more engaged. That, to me, if any leaders run an organization, my first bet would be on making sure that my managers are also inclusive leaders. Think about it as a multi-level marketing approach to changing your business. You find the people that have the most profound impact, the broadest reach first, and then those will be your managers. Those are the people that most of the time are going to be directly responsible for an individual employee's level of engagement within the organization.
Yeah, I would imagine, Kevin, that a lot of the benefit and a lot of the problems can occur at that mid-level management layer if you don't find a way to make sure you get it there, because you could have all the commitment to it up here and employees down here who want it, but if you don't get this mix right, you can create a lot of situations for your organization.
Well, and one of the interesting things about that is that if you read, say, for example, Leadership Pipeline, and you look at the data that's out there that says when people are promoted into management, they're typically in their late 20s, early 30s. Generally speaking, they don't get their first management class until they're in their early to mid 40s. And so now we know that we promote people primarily on technical competence. Now, sophisticated organizations are much more attuned to this, and they make sure that they're developing their leaders by creating high potential pools and things of that nature. But if you think about the majority of organizations out there that don't have that sophisticated approach to how they manage their talent, then you find that people are getting promoted without the toolkit necessary to be successful in their roles.
Right.
And what they generally do is they default to managing people to manage and do their roles the way they did their roles.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that flies in the face of inclusive leadership.
Yeah, that's always been a thing that I'm fascinated by, is how often we toss people into leadership roles and say, go ahead. And then of course it's your first leadership role. So the last thing you want to do is ask for help.
Yes.
And you're working without a strong tool set.
Yeah,
Yes.
and going back to Kevin, to what you said about, we promote based upon technical skills. You know, how many times you're looking at a new sales manager, and someone internally, they're discussing and they go, well, they're not really that good at sales. And it's like, are we hiring another salesperson? Or are we hiring a sales manager? And same thing with accounting. Are we hiring an accountant, or are we hiring someone who is good at managing accountants?
Yes.
But yes, for so long, and we've bounced that back and forth too in this podcast a few times about how so many times hiring is based on technical skills, not the management skills. So Kevin, if I'm a business leader, and obviously my primary focus is my numbers, am I making profit? Am I making money? Is everything going well? And say things are going well, I'm hitting my numbers, we've got record profits and everything. What are some signs that I need to look for, that I need to focus on, to be able to find out if I've got an EDI problem and I don't know it? It's an invisible problem right now.
I would say that it's not about identifying whether or not there's an EDI problem versus if there's an EDI opportunity.
Okay.
So if I set my benchmarks, let's say if I'm a historically not a diverse organization, not a very inclusive organization, and I look at my historical numbers, then I'm incrementing my numbers based on the market competition, as well as my own internal benchmarks.
Right.
What I'm not looking at is the possibility. The possibility that if in fact I invest in more diversification, will I have better ideas? The science tells us, the research tells us that I will. Will my cost of doing business go down? Research tells us that it will, because your turnover rate will be lower.
Right.
And will I be more profitable? The research tells us that you will, because you will have a more engaged workforce that's more productive and more efficient, and they make decisions faster and better. So I think that you look at it from an opportunistic perspective. It is asking it's asking yourself the question of what's possible if, in fact, I were to diversify my organization and in terms of its people, and what would be the possibilities in the marketplace? What profitability might I be able to achieve? What growth might I be able to achieve? What innovation might I be able to achieve in the marketplace?
Okay. Good. Great.
So, yeah, Kevin. So one of the things, I'm a coach when I'm not doing this. That's how we pay the
Same
bill.
here.
Yeah, there you go. So, and as you know, we have our goals. We know where we're trying to go, and inevitably, as a coach, we're trying to help them get through the barriers that always pop up that you don't expect. What are some of the common barriers that a business owner who's made this commitment and is trying to move towards that goal of increasing? What are some of the big barriers they're going to face as they start that process?
Number one is alignment, meaning that you have your whole leadership team aligned and bought into the value proposition. Number two will be, how do you integrate it into your strategy rather than doing something that, or approaching it as something separate and apart? Because EDI is really a strong foundational element of how you do work. How do you execute? And so in that, what you'll see is the institutionalization of your values. And if you truly value EDI, it's about walking the talk. It's about achieving congruence, my say-do ratio. And so alignment says we're going to do this, and here's all the reasons why, and we're going to support it. But also we're going to lead it at an executive and upper leadership level. Second is going to be, as I said before, it's going to be how are we going to embody this within our organization, how from a say-do ratio perspective. Then it's about spawning off and aligning with strategy, but it's about spawning off the initiatives that are going to have the most profound impact. And as I said earlier, how do you get management competence and capability as it relates to EDI to a higher level? Because that is where you're going to get the most initial bang for the buck. Because guess what? When I go in and I do focus groups, the number one fear that I hear around EDI or bringing up issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion is fear of retaliation, fear of not fitting in. And so often people don't speak up, and they don't have a speak up culture. They don't feel like they have allies within the organization. So to address that, generally organizations are going to set up an EDI steering committee. What they need to do is survey their organization to understand and get a pulse on what the real feelings are. I can tell you from experience that often those surveys won't get to the reality of your situation. It's just one data point. You'll need to interview people and conduct focus groups to really get to the real sentiment within your organization. And that too will lead you to that multifaceted approach will lead you to what are the most important big rocks, the wildly important goals that we really need to frame out and attack in order to make the most profound difference in our organization relative to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I would say that if you're going to, the most bang for your buck is going to be making sure that your managers are bought in and equipped. You know, your executive team first, aligned, connected to the strategy, managers are bought in and have the competencies necessary to lead from an EDI perspective.
Mm-hmm. Have you come upon any unique challenges or obstacles that perhaps, since we're starting with the executive team, that the executive team has in inculcating this EDI?
Yeah, it's the typical scenario of I don't have a problem, and everything I hear is that I don't have a problem, and then I ask the question that brings about a pause, which
Right.
is okay, and how much equity, or I should say, how much diversity is represented on your team?
Right.
And generally speaking, there's not very much of it, and so I'm like, that sort of explains the sense that you have that you're not getting a voice of the people that actually have challenges with this topic within your organization. And so the biggest challenge is getting past often is recognizing that this isn't just a program, that it's actually a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you're being cognizant and aware of the realities of your organization. And so, for example, there was a client I was working with, and we looked across the different sectors of their organization. And granted, they are a diverse organization, but when you start to look at where that diversity sits, it's not in the C-suite. It's
Right.
not in the senior leadership team. It's down on the front lines in many cases, and there's not broad representation. That is problematic within an organization that up here is saying that we are bought into EDI and that this is a commitment that we're making as an organization, when you don't see the representation of that commitment in your leadership and in your management.
Right. Right. Interesting. That's well, yes, that's very interesting. Okay. All right. And my mind was going somewhere else. And it was going to make a joke, but I didn't think it was appropriate at the time. So I self-edited myself, Craig. You'll be so happy.
Finally, we don't have to edit out all the bad jokes.
So anyway, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, Kevin, obviously, going back to the old diversity training, it comes down to understanding other people's perspective, to be able to increase that engagement, to increase that camaraderie, that trust within an organization. And if I'm correct, the focus of your doctoral thesis was African-American male worldview. And you talked about both the individual perspective and the group perspective. Can you peel that onion down and start by talking about individual perspective and then group perspective?
Yes. So one of the things that was really interesting to me is when I listened to other people talk about EDI or any issue that's about difference or race or gender, privilege, social justice, those types of things, is that we categorize people into groups: women, African Americans, Latinx, LGBTQ, as if all of the members of those groups are identical. And the
Right.
reality is that they're not. And they
Right.
don't want to be treated as a group. They want to be treated as an individual.
Right.
And so when we talk about the group orientation, yeah, we can make some broad-based statistical generalizations around demographics and other statistics, some positive, some negative, depending on the group that we're talking about. But what people really want is not like, I don't like when people ask me what it's like to be Black.
Right.
And the reason why is because I can't tell you that. I can tell you what it's like for me to be Black,
Yeah.
but I can't tell you what it's like for a myriad of other people to be Black, because we have different experiences, different worldviews.
Right.
And so I think we are better served than when we meet each other where we are and understand what the differences we have, but also the commonalities in our perspectives. So I can be sitting next to one of my best friends that may not be Black, and having a conversation about a myriad of different topics. And my perspective is just that in that conversation. I'm not saying, hey, let me tell you what Black people think. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, let me tell you about my lived experience. Let me tell you what I think. And if you'd like, I can tell you a little bit about my the foundation for me as to why I'm so such an advocate of an individual perspective, if you'd like to hear that story.
Sure.
So my life was the tale of two cities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent the first half of my childhood as a welfare kid in Port Arthur, Texas, in a predominantly Black community. Halfway through my childhood, I moved to Midland, Michigan to live with my dad and my stepmom. My dad was an accountant, my stepmom was a chemist. The tale of two cities.
Yeah.
I was one of a handful of African American kids in Midland, Michigan. And that was a culture shock for me, especially given the biases that had been ingrained in me from my upbringing in Port Arthur to that point in time, and then navigating this new environment, carrying around those rules, those biases in my head.
Right.
And not even recognizing that they were biases back then. I was just a kid.
Yeah.
My senior year, I ended up going back to Port Arthur, Texas for my senior year of high school. And when I went to Midland, I call it my acculturation experience, which is I didn't have a choice. I was immersed in this environment, and I had to figure out how to survive and navigate that environment. So the first phase was survival, different and survival. And I was not very adaptive into that environment. I did not assimilate into that environment. I was maintaining my dress, my vernacular, and everything, all the while my dad and my stepmom were trying to get me to not axe people and leave blood all over the place, and in terms of ask, and the whole language and dialect of speaking that I had. And so I kind of went through this transformation as a result of this immersion. That experience has shaped my worldview to this day, because I have a foot in both ends of the world. I will always and forever be defined as a Black man. Right. And in terms of how society sees me and views me. But my mindset is that of a Black man, of a person that's worked in Germany, a person that's worked in the Czech Republic, a person that lived in Midland, Michigan, a person that is in an interracial marriage.
I think that's the first time that Midland, Michigan has been thrown in with Germany and the Czech Republic.
Each one of those experiences has shaped me. Yeah. And so when we look at, a person that has those similar experiences may have a similar worldview that I have, or they may have even different worldview based on other influences in their lives. Right. And so again, when we talk about approaching people, we need to be really mindful of the fact that everyone wants to be treated like an individual. They don't want to be the group. They want to be their unique selves. And that's why of the 5 points that I named earlier, the second one is valued for my uniqueness. Yeah. My unique perspective, my unique experience, my unique story.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think we can put it in simpler facts when we talk about millennials. Yes. Everyone has this vision of a millennial. as this young kid, flip-flops, tie-dye shirt and shorts on, and they don't want to do a lot of work. And that is really not what millennials are. But there is that perspective that, oh, you're a millennial, so I'm assuming things. And I would probably say the same thing would be true for you in your situation.
Absolutely. I think we all are a set of lived experiences. I think we all are somewhere on the number line of how comfortable we are becoming uncomfortable. I think that, people with narrow sets of experiences are more uncomfortable stepping outside of those. People with broader sets of experiences are much more comfortable in a broader set of situations.
Right.
And I believe that that needs to be recognized in terms of how we define our approach to where people are and meeting people where they are, expecting rather than expecting for them to meet us where we are.
Right.
Great. Well, I think we were thinking we'd jump into a question about assimilation and acculturation, but you just hit on it in your discussion of your tale of two cities. And so I think the next question that I think we have is, this kind of comes down to us. One of the things we talk about a lot in the podcast is measuring. It's important to measure. Lou and I have robust debates around the value of going with your gut. He's wrong, I'm right, but it's okay. We won't have to go into that today, Kevin. But what we do always agree on is you have to measure, to measure success, set a number out there that you're going towards. In this context, how do you measure success? What does success look like where I say, I am now a culturally diverse and inclusive workspace? How do I know when I'm there?
I think the simple way to do it is a baseline of where you were and a baseline of where you are. And you set some targets to go from current state to desired state. And this is not all about increasing percentages and representation as much, because we can do that all day, but if we don't take advantage of that representation, if we don't foster it, grow that potential to make people feel included, it's really kind of all for naught. It's window dressing. We can spit out a statistic that says we have this number of people on our team and so many people represented in management and so forth, and across different types of diversity. But it's really more about how do we measure the holistic impact of that diversity? Okay, so one is representation in numbers. Okay, I think everybody gets that. And I think that can create some conflict too in terms of how rigorous our hiring process needs to be and our vetting process for promotions and high potentials and things of that nature to make sure that those processes are equitable, but that the most qualified candidate actually comes out. If you have a scoring mechanism, if that is a diverse candidate on the back end and they didn't score the highest score, you're not doing them any service by promoting them.
Right.
All right. You're not doing your organization any organizational good by doing that. And so then you look at customer satisfaction for customers from standpoint of if they value diversity as an organization, how are they rating you? How are your internal employees rating you in terms of how they feel about being included and having an opportunity to advance and contribute to the organization? Do they feel valued? Do they feel like they're getting appreciation and gratitude for their contributions? So I think it's a broad set of metrics, a balanced set, but a broad set. And are we seeing the profitability that we expected to gain from being more diverse? Now, I do want to break down this diversity component a bit more.
Sure.
I consider the EEOC definitions of protected categories and so forth complex diversity. I consider
that's because government came up with it.
No, I think it stretches who we are in very different ways. I think the foundational element, though, is difference, managing difference. I like to go fast, you like to go slow. I like to multitask, you like to focus. I prefer to be direct, you prefer indirectness. Those continuums and the multitude of them, which basically make up the 5-factor model of personality of why people are different from other people in their preferences and so forth, and their motivational needs are different. If we can't manage at that simple level to value people that are different than us, because I ask these questions all the time, which is I do an activity where people have to check off what they think their strengths are and what are the strengths that they prefer in others. More than 90% of the time, they're the same. All right, we want to surround ourselves with people like ourselves that meet our motivational needs. So think about just starting at that point of understanding difference, valuing difference, embracing difference, and being able to be identify the synergy and have those differences understood at that level. I think that's foundational before we can actually start to navigate effectively these more complex diversities, right? Which is related to gender and sexual orientation, ability, and the broad array of those differences that we know in terms of the definitions of protected categories.
Right.
And so, with that, what that means is that if I can't value you and you have a different communication style than me, and I can't navigate the value of you being you and me being me, and that we need to co-create a space where we can take advantage of the uniquenesses that we bring. Think about all the social, the brain damage that's associated when now that other person is a woman, and all the social biases around women in leadership roles, or people of color in leadership roles, or being a member of the LGBTQ community, and all the stereotypes that are associated with members of those particular groups, and so forth. I got to get this other piece I got to get some competency here in the place where it doesn't hurt as much before I can really be proficient and really grow to be able to do it in a much more complex situation. So I think we undervalue just managing and negotiating basic differences in preferences amongst ourselves.
Mhm.
And I think it's important that we point that out, and that we get better at doing that and use that as a platform to be able to manage these more complex issues.
Right. Wow. Wow. I'm looking at the time here and I have one more question, but I
Okay.
think this question is actually going to be another episode of Q&A on breakthrough leadership. And that is, how do we go about setting up a program for EDI? But that, I think we could spend another 40 minutes on that one. So Kevin, at this point, and we definitely want to bring you back for that particular, that podcast episode, because I believe that we've given everyone a lot of information here, talked about EDI and exactly what it involves, what it entails, what it looks like, what it smells like. And now we need to give our listeners and viewers the next piece of the puzzle, which is how we put that together, but for another episode. So with that, normally what we do, Kevin, is we wrap up our episodes by doing key takeaways. And so, Craig, give us your key takeaway when it comes to EDI and what Kevin told us.
Well, Kevin, I think first, thanks for coming on. Thanks for helping us out here today. There's a lot of great information. I think there was a lot to take on, but I think the piece that keeps bumping around in my head is that you said just a few minutes ago, was this idea of looking not only at the group, but also considering the individual, because not every individual with the group has the same perspective as you might put on the group as a whole. And so I think that's a really interesting dynamic as we start to look forward to how to build this out in our organizations. So thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah. Hey, and my key takeaway, as usual, is Craig stole my key takeaway, so I have to go to my second choice.
Great to go first.
But I will say this, Craig, and Kevin's never been on our podcast before, but I believe one of the key takeaways I've drawn from this is we just ask questions and listen to Kevin. We said nothing. I mean, usually you and I are participating, but this knowledge, as you and I admitted early on, I mean, this is not an area where we're experts, but we know it's an important issue that companies, business leaders need to begin addressing. And so I'm sitting here in awe because I felt like I was being taught and didn't have any questions to ask except for ones every now and then. But my key takeaway, if I have to say so, is our country has a long way to go. And I mean, I know that we've had some very significant tragic incidences that have brought us to this point where we're now reflecting, and companies and business leaders are looking internally, and especially when you've got the next generation of leaders who are populating the workforce in numbers that are beating boomers and Gen Xers right now, and they are demanding it because they grew up more in a society where they didn't think about differences. They didn't think about any of that. And I truly believe that the next big change in the workforce is going to be EDI. So that's my key takeaway. So Kevin, what's your key takeaway?
I just believe that every one of us wakes up every day just trying to achieve our share of the American dream, that we have families that we care about, that we want to send our kids to school or give them opportunities. We want them to have better opportunities than the ones that we may have had. And I think, my takeaway is that people need to just recognize that at the basis is that we may not all agree on how to accomplish those goals, but they're still the goals. That's the thing we have in common as Americans. The other thing is that I just want people to walk away with those 5 things. If you want to be better in this area, 5 things you should be doing. Getting better at helping people on your team belong, getting better at helping them feel like they're valued for their unique contributions, getting better at showing gratitude and appreciation for those, getting better at the 3 things I just named and working at that consciously. And 4th is making sure that you're modeling and modeling behavior that fosters an environment that values inclusion, equity, and diversity.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, Kevin, before we leave, we're going to give you the opportunity here to give a plug for you, how people can get in touch with you. And also tell us a little bit about you're an author of a book called Think, Change Your Story, Change Your Life. Give our readers yeah, I'm talking about books, so I said readers. Give our viewers and listeners a little peek into the book and also how they can get in touch with you.
The way to reach me is transformationpoint.com. I'm dating myself. Or through executivedevelopmentassociates.com as well. My book is Think, Change Your Story, Change Your Life. It really is about a traveler on a journey of achieving their potential. And in that book, the traveler meets many elders in different cities with a different focus, using a Socratic approach, asking them questions to help them to reframe their perspective and to grow. And I parallel with that story, my personal story, navigating each one of those cities and my conversations with each one of those elders. And I continue to this day to be on that journey of trying to be the best possible self that I can be. And I hope that I can be an influence and a value to anyone that's trying to navigate that same journey.
Terrific. Awesome. Terrific. Well, and people can go out to Amazon to buy that book, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, good, good, fantastic. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for enlightening Craig and I and our viewers and listeners about the subject of equality, diversity, and inclusion. It's an important topic, one that we're just starting to hear a lot about, but I think we're going to be hearing so much more about it in the next few years, where it will truly become a pinnacle for many organizations and a true focus point for their operations moving forward. So, Kevin, thanks for joining us on Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. We hope that you'll come back and we can talk a little bit about how do I set up this EDI program. So,
absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. Take care.
Lou, that was a great interview with Kevin. I think as we went through there, as you said, it was one of the few times where we talked hardly at all during the podcast, and there was so much to absorb there. I'm glad he agreed to come back.
Yeah. And I'm sure that many of our viewers and listeners appreciate more of the interviewee than the interviewers.
That is probably a safe assumption. So if you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe on whatever platform you happen to follow us on. We're on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and at QAleadership.com. And we're finding an increasing number of you enjoy listening to us on podcast form, and we are on all your favorite podcasting platforms. So until next time, I'm Craig Anderson.
And keep your hands washed. Keep your distance. I'm Lou Quinto.